Hi, I'm Lisa. Welcome to How Tuesdays at Lori's Country Cottage. Today we're going to talk about mitered corners, why you'd want to do them, and how to do them. Join me. Mitered corners. Why would you want to use mitered corners on the border of your quilt? Well, there are several reasons. If you're doing some wall art and you want your borders to really make it look like a frame, most frames have mitered corners, so you'd want to miter your corners. If you want to do some color play with the borders on your quilt and have multicolored borders, a mitered corner also looks really nice. And here's an example of how that looks. Another reason you might want to use mitered corners is if you have a very printed border, and it might look very obvious if you chop it off and have regular square corners. Sometimes a mitered corner is better. And also, when I use mitered corners the most, if I'm putting multiple borders on my quilt, 3 or 4 borders, I can sew my 4 borders together in a strata and attach them to my quilt all at once. Let me show you how it's done. So mitered corners require some math if you do them the traditional way. So my rectangle of fabric is 17 inches by 20 inches. So if I was doing the technical way of doing borders, I would measure the length of my quilt and cut my border strip the length of my quilt plus 2 times the finished width of my border. So this border is cut 3.5, so my finished width is 3. So it would be 20 inches plus 2 times 3 is 6. I would cut 26 inches. I would find the middle of my strip, the middle of the side of my quilt, and pin from the middle out, and my corners would match perfectly. But as time goes on and quilters learn more, there's an easier way of doing it. So you can see on my sample that clearly my border strips are much larger and longer than my quilt. There's just less math and less messing around. So I know my border strip needs to be at least the length I need, plus twice my finished edge, and I just make it a whole lot bigger to make it easier. So here's how we're going to put on our borders. Lay your quilt, so pretend this is a whole quilt top. Lay it right side down, and on all 4 corners, take your ruler and mark a 1/4 inch line in the corner, and again, a 1/4 inch line. And you'll do that on all 4 corners, and we need this exact point for when we sew. So mark your 4 corners. I've stitched on 3 of my borders already so that I can show you how to miter the corners. The other thing a little bit different about mitered corners is normally when we stitch borders on a quilt, we're going to put the border strip on top like this and stitch down on our machine. Mitered corners work upside down. I need to see these 2 corner marks, so I'm going to stitch with my quilt top on top. Let me show you how that's done. So here I am at my machine, and you can see my pencil mark. I've already put one of my borders on just to save you watching me do some stitching. So I'm just going to fold this out of the way. My green strip is underneath, and I want my needle exactly in the crosshairs of those 2 lines. So there it is. Going to put my foot down, make sure my needle is down, and I'm just going to stitch on this border with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, just like usual. Of course, if you're working on a full-size quilt, you might want to pin this because it's a little bit awkward working with the border strip underneath, and you have your quilt tugging on the left-hand side trying to fall off your table. So as I come up to the end, let me just match these up. I do want my needle to stop exactly on that crosshair. So again, I'm going to fold this border out of the way. I can see my crosshairs. So how do I do that if my stitch isn't naturally going to stop in that spot? I can shorten my stitch length, or I can simply apply pressure with my hand and make it stop where I want it to stop. Let's move over to the cutting surface and see how I did. All right, let's miter the borders. Here's another little difference between regular borders and mitered borders. Normally on a quilt, we would press our seam allowance toward the border because we have piecing in the middle. But for mitered corners, we want to press our border fabric to the quilt top. And here's why. Here is my quilt top with my 2 border strips extra long. I need to match these 2 seams together, and I'm going to do it by folding my quilt top right sides together. I'm going to line up my borders just roughly because there's going to be some fine tuning. And now I need those 2 seam lines to stack perfectly on top of each other, and you can feel whether they are stacked or not. Once my seam lines are stacked perfectly and my edges of my borders are aligned, I always put a couple pins just to hold things in place. And I should have brought my flower-headed pins today because I'm going to use my ruler. So a flower-headed pin is always better because it's flat, but I'm gonna make it work. So my stitching line needs to create a straight line in this direction. On my ruler, whether you use a square ruler or a rectangle ruler, you have a 45-degree line, and that's what we're trying to do. So I want to line my ruler up with the edge of my fabric, and I'm going to watch this 45-degree line and make sure it's on the edge of my borders, lining up both. So this is lined up, and it's a 45-degree angle. And perfect. There is my stitch, the beginning stitch for my border. I need to draw a line from that stitch to the edge of my border, doing my best not to yank on the fabric because it's a biased edge. Once I have my line, I want to secure that with pins. Let me show you that one more time. Here is my next corner. Oh, it's coming out because I've been moving this around. There are my 2 borders. I fold it right sides together, lining up my border. This just shows me the orientation to remind me how it needs to lay. Then I'm going to feel my seams and make sure they're stacked perfectly on top of each other. Flatten out my quilt, line up my border strips, and with all my extra fabric here, it just gives me leeway later to make any adjustments if I need to. When you're working with a big quilt, it can be cumbersome. So I like to secure my quilt together with some pins. Looking for that 45-degree angle, I'll line up my ruler, find my 45-degree line, line it up on here, slide it back until I'm lined up both here and here. Oh look, my perfect stitch mark is right there. Draw my line and secure that with pins. Let's move to the sewing machine and stitch up those corners. All right, let's stitch right on the line. And the most important part of this step is to get your needle, again, right on that point. So I'm going to use the hand crank on my machine, put my needle exactly in that point, and now stitch on that line. I like to shorten my stitch length at this step because I'm going to put some extra pressure on that seam. Here we go. And also in mitered borders, it doesn't hurt to give a little back stitch right at the end because we're going to put some pressure on that with our iron. I'm going to show you that one more time. Here's the other corner that I've marked. My needle goes exactly in that point. Put my foot down and stitch on the line. And again, just a tiny reverse stitch right at the end because we're going to be yanking on that later. Let's go see how I did. So here's my mitered corners. You always want to look first before you cut because you can always pull your stitching out and re-stitch it. You have to be careful because you're on a biased edge, but this is a beautiful mitered corner. Good for me. I'm going to press it first to one side and I'm going to repress that after I trim. Let's look at the other corner. This one is not quite as pretty, but it's pretty close. And you know what? In real life, I would leave that. And this is where our iron is a great friend. I can flatten that seam out and I'm going to push it to the side, give it a good press with my iron, and I'm happy with that. Let me show you how to trim them off. So here we are with my beautiful mitered corners. I just need to trim my tails off. So I'm going to trim to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Please be careful not to cut your quilt in this step. There's my corner. Now when I flip it open, it's a beautiful mitered corner. Now you can choose to leave your mitered corner pressed to one side, but I do always go back and press my seams open. They just lie nice and flat. And here's what a mitered corner looks like, all finished. Thanks for joining me for How Tuesdays at Lori's Country Cottage. I hope you'll try mitered corners on one of your future projects.